And so the last Digital Literacy Cafe was back to school with generative AI. That was our first opportunity to take a look back what happened almost over the summer in terms of preparing for back to school in 2023. Our guests in that cafe talked about their experiences putting together campus-wide guidelines and statements and policies regarding the curricular use of generative AI. And what brings us together in the September Cafe are three thought leaders who each direct centers of teaching and learning or excellence or writing programs on their campus. And each will share a collection of lesson plans that have successfully integrated generative AI into the curriculum on their campuses. Our conversation will highlight the best practices across the disciplines, and we aim to provide resources that can be easily used by any instructor in any higher education context. And so we will be sure that through many different means, including a follow-up email, you will get this URL to this archive, this collection of everything that we're talking about today. And I'm just going to briefly go around the room and introduce three guests. First is Dr. Justin Hodson, who's the co-creator of the Digital Gardener Initiative at Indiana University. He's associate professor of digital rhetoric in the English department at Indiana University Bloomington, and the founding editor of the Journal of Undergraduate Multimedia Projects, known as JUMP. He's also a digital literacy thought leader. Justin, thanks for being with us this morning. I also want to introduce my longtime colleague, Dan Anderson, who's a professor of English and comparative literature and the director of the writing program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I am still technically on the faculty and where I used to also direct the first year writing program. Dan, thank you for being with us today. And then Bruce Frazier, who is the director of the Institute for Academic Excellence and a professor of philosophy at Indian River State College in Florida, near where I grew up. So Bruce, thanks for being here. I'm going to start with Justin. Justin, if you just kind of give us an overview of the materials you brought to share today, and then we'll go around the horn and see what everyone brought to the conversation today. Justin, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Todd. I appreciate being here. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Hopefully, we provide some useful content today. A little bit about me first. I lead faculty development across IU in the Digital Gardener program, which is a digital literacy initiative to try and help other faculty learn how to bring digital literacy, digital creativity, digital learning into their classrooms with students. But when I'm not doing that, I'm also a faculty member, and I teach digital writing, very generically oriented, in that we think about what does writing look like and how do technologies impact writing. And so what I'm going to show today is from a class. It's called English 171, Projects in Digital Literacy and Composition. It's a relatively new course at Indiana University, designed to infuse digital literacy as a core element into first-year composition sort of expectations. And so we kind of play with the model a little bit, play with the rules to try and figure out what we can do that's going to prepare students to be successful, not only in terms of traditional writing practices, but also in engaging with digital technologies as they progress through their time at IU. So let me share my screen real quick. We'll do the whole desktop just in case. Yeah, okay. And we'll slide this guy out of the way. So I made this Express page today because most of the assignments live in Canvas, and it just doesn't have the same sort of pizzazz as an Express page. So I'm going to cover just three real quick activities that we've done in class this semester, and talk about, and we can get into stuff later about like an ethics of practice or some syllabi kind of statements. But for the most part, we started really simple, which is I wanted to introduce students to just what is generative AI and how do they start to think about it in a sort of healthy, active, responsible kind of way. And so I had a guest speaker, Sarah Fisher, who helped design this assignment and came and delivered it. And we started with having students think about design concepts, and they had to recreate a poster and make a counter poster using Adobe Express. In this case, they were combining Barbie and Oppenheimer, right? And so they had to create these counter statements. And many of them chose to use generative AI inside of Adobe Express to create like explosion effects to put behind Barbie, rather than simply using the assets we provided. And so that was a starting point of creating with generative text, generative technologies. And then from that, they went into this process of thinking about, okay, now you have this thing you've created. Why don't we partner with Claude AI or ChatGPT and see about generating a text that offers a kind of commentary on what you've created? And so their challenge was to really think through the kind of prompts they would need to get the tool to create something that mattered and that would work for their output. Ultimately, they had to take the image and the text that was generated and put it into an Adobe Express webpage and submit it that way. And these have multiple purposes because it's meant to introduce them to not only the tools and technology, but also to kind of get them a place to start that's creative, that's low stakes, sort of minimal investment, but a fun kind of in-class engagement because they were working in partners or teams. And the big one for me is they had to like read and revise and rewrite the text that was created to start thinking about this from the starting point as something I'm going to maybe look at, but I have to read it and I have to engage with it and I have to maybe rethink it because it doesn't always give us the right kind of perspectives or options. And then, of course, in every class we have, because it's an active learning space, when we do things in class as activities, there's always a discussion point at the end where they're sharing out what they've learned with each other, sharing out what they've learned with the class. And both in activity 1 and activity 2, that's really the takeaway. It's not so much can they make stuff, because most of us can make these things dance in fun ways. It's can they think critically about what they're making and how that might then lead them toward the decisions that they've made. And that's the rhetorical part for me as a teacher, a digital rhetoric teacher, right? More recently, we've started to move into assignment 2, which is all about digital storytelling. And so in this case, we had a 2-part process to ask them to use ChatGPT or Claude AI as a kind of collaborative on-demand idea resource, right? So it's rhetorical invention, but we start with what makes a compelling story, right? Or what are the features of a compelling story? And then they sort of have this sort of global level view of understanding what that might look like. And then we move into what are some strategies you might use for your own specific topic or context. And again, they're working in pairs. We have active learning tables that they're all part of. But the goal is to not have the machine answer or give them the topic and run with it, but to give them some things to consider and then to work through those processes to identify what might have, bear more fruit than others. And it's very similar to the rhetorical practices I've used before tied to rhetorical invention. It's just that in this case, we're kind of speeding things up a little bit with the tool, helping orient them around strategies and purposes, and then ultimately getting into the hands-on activity of thinking about specific context approaches that may or may not work for their group. And again, they had to share with each other and share with the class, and we identified commonalities and concerns and considerations as a sort of strategy for thinking about these tools in action. So that's the kind of quick 4-minute, 5-minute version, Todd. I think that covers most of them. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, but I want to make sure I have time for my colleagues to share their brilliant stuff too.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. We'll do the same thing with Bruce. And again, there's a couple questions about everything that everyone mentions today is going to be in the archive at the URL. You don't need to copy down anything other than that one URL to make sure you can get access to everything we're talking about today. So Bruce, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a little context before I talk about the assignment. Indian River State College is an open enrollment college. We serve a 4-county area on the eastern coast of Central Florida. Many of our students are first generation. Many of our students come to us academically underprepared. They may lack an understanding of important things like citation, peer review, evidential justification, logic, right? And many of them have a tremendous fear of both writing and a fear of failing. I teach writing intensive courses. My background is in philosophy. The course I'll share with you today is critical thinking. There's a fair amount of writing in that class. So many of our students come to us with this fear of writing and this fear of failure. They are unclear on the importance of academic integrity, and this creates an environment in which many students feel the need to get outside help on their assignments. So they will cheat, they will plagiarize, some not knowingly, some intentionally. My point is that what this does at Indian River is it places a pretty heavy burden on faculty, makes them feel as if academic integrity is the central issue when it comes to the emergence of generative AI. As the director of our Institute for Faculty Professional Development, I'm pushing a different narrative around the importance of generative AI, one that's really about the integration of AI. In other words, what I'd like to see is that we create spaces where students have the opportunity to ethically engage with generative AI, and in contexts where they're working through traditional academic content and problems. We want to focus on process rather than academic outcomes in terms of assignments produced. We want to focus on the students' engagement through the learning process that leads to an outcome that is generative AI informed. We're looking for opportunities to create dialogue, around what lessons are generalizable from our engagements with artificial intelligence, because this is not going away. You know, I have said since ChatGPT emerged on the scene that banning this technology in higher education is certainly not going to work. We don't want to be positioned to police our students, to surveil our students. What are the opportunities here for engaging our students with Gen AI? So the assignment that I'll share with you is built around that philosophy. I'll confess that this is an assignment that is the result of a number of small failures in integrating Gen AI last spring. I spent some time in my critical thinking course in the spring, introducing students to Gen AI in the context of the class, working with them with ChatGPT to explore how this technology might give insight into the topics that we were covering in the class. There were technical limitations for our students. They couldn't really engage some of them with this technology outside of the classroom. It made it difficult to assign work that was related to ChatGPT. And frankly, I was not clear enough at that stage on just what generative AI informed teaching might look like. So over the summer, with the input of a number of faculty colleagues, and after doing a fair amount of reading on generative AI, including Sid Dobrin's new book on AI in writing, I came up with this assignment that has the following components. First of all, I think it's very important to remind students of what they're doing at the beginning of an assignment, to remind them of, in this case, really what critical thinking is all about, and then give them a clear statement of why and how generative artificial intelligence is going to intersect with this topic area. The assignment itself attempts to focus on process. It gives students the opportunity to engage with generative AI and specifically ChatGPT in this case outside of class, but it gives them small units to engage with. And then we come back into a classroom setting and we have a dialogue about what they're doing. I think that dialogue is important both to assess their learning, because, you know, where academic integrity is concerned, certainly we don't want them just producing something that they don't understand through ChatGPT. So I bring them back into class to have conversations about the various elements of this assignment. I initially want them to assess their own level of knowledge around a topic that they have identified as interesting to them, and they'll explore through the context of the entire course. I then, based on in-class lectures about aspects of generative AI and some demonstrations, will invite them to come up with their own prompts to see what ChatGPT comes up with respect to their topic area, and then invite them to re-engage with that platform to try and refine its output. I introduce them to Gen AI hallucinations and the problem of bias. So part of the assignment focuses on bias mitigation and verification of output, which I think is crucial in developing higher order thinking skills. And then I have them write up their results at the end to pull together their own reflections. We engage in conversation in class to draw out the general lessons. Although this is specific to philosophy, I think that the elements of an assignment like this are generalizable. As an aside, we don't have a Gen AI policy yet at Indian River State College. And so the importance of drawing out general lessons from assignments like this is that it can help inform the conversation institutionally about what policy might be appropriate for handling generative AI. I've included a syllabus statement here further down in this document as an illustration of the kind of policy that I think is appropriate at the course level to help students understand their ethical responsibilities and appropriate uses of Gen AI. I invite them to engage with me throughout the course if there's any question as to whether or not their usage is appropriate. So all in all, this assignment and the context, the course level context in which it's offered, I think is a healthy step toward providing a context where we can really examine the old and new, the interaction between the old and the new, meaning, the interaction of this transformative technology with traditional academic methods and values. Because I think, as Todd has indicated, this is a really transformative technology, and it's going to change fundamentally the way we think about knowledge acquisition and topic areas such as critical reasoning. So that's my 5-minute spiel. Thank you very much. I will turn it over to you, Todd.
Dan, all right. Dan, if you'd go ahead and bring up your screen and unmute and share what you're doing, I will. And so there's a lot of questions in the chat pod. I don't have the permission on the Google Doc set correctly. I will take care of that directly. So don't worry about that. That link will be repaired very shortly. So over to you, Dan.
Great. Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Justin and Bruce. Kind of following along from Justin and Bruce, been focusing on how to actually integrate, turn this into a key aspect of writing. And in the spirit of sharing teaching assignments, I want to give some of our departmental programmatic resources to you all, but talk quickly about something I did over the summer, which had to do with AI. And so one of the things that we really tried to get into was a sense of process and transparency while students were using AI. So ahead of time, before I would do something with them, I would create a link to, say, the sample prompts that I had done, so I could guide students through how they would work on some of these prompts. And then after students would do this, I would ask them to reflect. So they completed this assignment, and then they would go through and discuss. The bulk of students had never actually used AI, even though it seems to be in the news that everyone is going AI crazy. So they also then would include links to the transcripts of their AI sessions. So very kind of process oriented. And this assignment is linked to prompt engineering. And so the idea that they would start by doing some prompting that doesn't work very well, get better at it, and pay attention to that process while they're going. And then taking this in a different direction in terms of the timing, that's all happening kind of simultaneously, getting better at AI. I would give them a different process of what if you do all of that intellectual work ahead of time? And here's where it gets really rhetorical. Think about the context, think about the purpose, think about the output instructions and all of that, and then compose a much more detailed prompt that brings all of this intellectual work together, and then send that along. So that was kind of our one activity that we did that gets you kind of into that space. And you can see by the links that I had given to the students how the thinking programmatically has evolved. Earlier in the summer, I was in this space of when students submit a AI project, a project that used AI, they would track all of this. And the main takeaway here is openness and transparency, disclosure, paying attention to what's going on. So what tools did they use? And I kind of took these intellectual stages and mapped it all out. And then they could put links in, and this really kind of onerous sense of how you would want to document your use of AI. And we found very quickly in practice that that was not pragmatic and was actually holding people back intellectually more so than helping them. It was more of a police operation. So moved to something that was much thinner in some ways. Did you use AI in your research? Did you use it in your drafting? Did you use it in your revision? And this moving toward a kind of awareness. And then really distilling even more at the end, the kind of minimal requirement that we ended up programmatically putting forth in front of instructors and students was to, when you submit a project, either attest that you didn't use AI or a test that you did, and list some of the ways. So over the last 3 or 4 months, we've gotten much less police-like on some of this documentation, but still moving in this mode of transparency. So that's kind of how things have played out in the classroom with a lot of these. And then programmatically, where we've gone with this is we've created these modules And I'll walk you through one or two of them really quickly. So, and you can kind of see familiarity with writing instruction over the years. So this is the, plagiarism documentation module. How do you document these things? Thinking about integrity. The module has a quiz. It's got some readings. And then it comes with a video, which is a screen recording that walks students through when to document, when not to document. But if you go through this and look at this module, a lot of it is what you would see in any writing handbook. It's if you're summarizing, here's how you can do it with integrity. If you're paraphrasing, if you're actually taking some materials, here's how you do it. So this is not really very far from how we've been teaching over the years, operating with integrity, documenting your work. The next module is biases and fact checking. So this one is probably more relevant for how AI is rupturing things or disrupting things a little bit more. It walks students through, information, some readings. It has quizzes as well. And then the instructional video here talks about some of the hallucinations, or, if you ask if who was the first to cross the Atlantic by foot, and it gives you an answer how you've got, to watch out for these. And then kind of the culmination of this is this module that's linked toward prompting and thinking. And this is integrating much more so along the lines of, as Bruce was saying, critical thinking, or how does AI now kind of just, another iteration in the way that computers, technology, and communication have been linked over the millennia, and where are we now? So this is a very process-oriented video and set of module materials here that guide students through the way that you're thinking while you're prompting, and the importance of having their own background knowledge and making their own decisions as you move through here. So these modules are made for the Canvas LMS. There's a link. I don't know if the commons that they share on my campus will work with others, but the text of the modules is all in place on these pages as well, so that you can come and reproduce these if it's useful for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. All right. And so I'm going to reorganize all the spotlights here, bring everyone back on stage. We're going to talk about commonalities, consensus that we're seeing so far, as well as different points, unique approaches and unique ideas, and maybe some points of contrast in terms of the approaches here. This is meant to be a very explorative, collaborative experiment and a comparative study of all these different approaches. This, from my perspective, is very much early days in the world of generative AI. I feel like this summer, the summer of 2023, was the first opportunity we had to kind of take a breath and start organizing our responses to these things. And now we're in the early stages of testing out what works and what doesn't. And we know very well that this ground is going to keep changing. A couple of housekeeping notes. I think I fixed the link to Bruce's Google Doc. So if you'll follow that link, that should be working. There's a couple people who keep raising their hand. Sorry that we can't respond to that. But the Q&A pod is the way to raise your hand and ask questions. And we hope to get to as many of those questions verbally as we can after we go through this segment. And so let's go around the horn and let's talk about sort of what we see as consensus so far. One of the things that I think we're seeing is this idea that, first of all, that we don't want to be prohibitive, that head in the sand isn't going to work. There's a comment in the Q&A that's very relevant here, which is most faculty really need a lot of education and support and information about all of these things, because very few, or maybe not enough of them, know exactly what's going on and where this is headed. And it can obviously feel intimidating at first. I think, the focus of this webinar and the consensus that's coming together is that we need to support this learning outcome of students becoming critical, ethical, and agile users of these emerging knowledge-making technologies. And we know there are more that are going to keep coming, and we know that AI is going to morph and change, and then this is just the beginning. And so the idea is the classic, we're not going to give students fish, we want to teach them to learn how to fish themselves, because 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this is going to be a continually changing landscape. And so they need to have the kinds of critical questions that in habits of mind that help them become agile in response to these technologies. I think that's one of the most consistent commonalities that we've heard so far among our three panelists, is that in order to become these critical users, they have to put their hands on. We can't prohibit or deny. We can't make it mostly about policing or surveilling. We need to be aware of those issues and create teachable moments around them. And at the same time, we need students to be able to figure out how generative AI works by doing the kinds of reflective things that we've seen in a lot of these exercises. And so folks on the panel, just physically raise your hand and say, what else do you see as sort of the consensus or commonality, things that were familiar in each of the exercises we shared, and then points of potential contrast that we may want to explore further. Who'd like to begin? Go, Justin.
Yeah, I'll go. So I think, something we found with working with faculty, and as the same as working with students, is that there's not only there are a lot of misconceptions about what these things do, but there's a fundamental need to let them play with the tools, right? And I know that's a commonality we have, but I think that thinking about an opportunity and presenting it as an opportunity is a way that sort of shifted how students are responding to it. So that's one sort of thing to come out. And the other one for me is, and I don't know, Dan or Bruce, if you guys do this, something we've been talking about a lot is with faculty in general is making sure that they restate their policies or practices for each assignment, right? Because students they'll be in 4 classes and they're going to come to my class and forget the rules that govern what they can do in my class, because it's different from class 2, 3, 4, and 5. So they're getting 5 different takes on what is and isn't allowed. And so there's just something I've been finding is a kind of confusion. I don't know if I know that part of what we're doing in our system and getting to think critically is to be aware of those things, but those are like 2 easy things that seem similar, I think, as a potential value of the way that Dan and Bruce are approaching it, the way we're talking about it at IU.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, especially from my position as directing professional development for faculty, I see something very healthy in this organic approach to engaging playfully with AI. But we have to also make this part of an institutional conversation that informs institutional policy. I think in each of these approaches, this is at least implicit that these kinds of exercises, assignments, these approaches to educating faculty need to be grafted onto other institutional projects. So, for example, discussions about learning outcomes and assessment at the program level, something that needs to be informed by what we're talking about instructionally at the departmental and the course level. Because unless we're articulating AI literacy and translating that into program level outcomes and talking about assessment and so forth, we're really not going to get the kind of institutional traction we need to affect the change we want and support faculty appropriately.
Yeah, one thing I would observe, commenting, following up is when students do get a chance to experiment with this, you find a lot of the kind of learning light bulbs that you get typically in any kind of situation where things are working well. So we did literature reviews over the course of the summer and used AI, and eventually the number of hallucinations that were showing up in these literature reviews frustrated the students to the point that they just decided, I'm going to go to the library database. I know these sources are going to be there and they're what I need. So, they came to their own conclusion rather than some institutional hammer being held over their head. And I think that worked out pretty well.
Right, great. And so in the Q&A pod and in the conversation we just had, it seems to be that this learning outcome is fairly well supported. It makes sense that, we want to help students become critical, ethical, and agile users of emerging knowledge-making technologies. And obviously this one is really important. We then started to touch on, okay, so how do we do this? And there's a lot of questions in the chat pod about assessment and about measurement of the success of this first wave of exercise and assignment. All the educational research I've seen supports the idea that students learn best by making, by creating, by doing, by engaging, by applying. In Justin's words, playing with these technologies. And Dan supported that idea as well. And so there seems to be a pretty good consensus on that. The questions in the Q&A pod right now, there's 19 of them, and they're all incredible. This is the richest Q&A pod I've ever seen. And there's no way we can get to all of them. This is a bit overwhelming. This is in some ways like the old fable or mythology about there are three people who are blindfolded, and there's an elephant standing in front of them, and each of them is holding on to a different part of it. The one holding on to the tail says it's an aardvark. The one holding on to the leg says it's a hippopotamus. And the one holding on to the trunk says, no, it's the other way. The one holding on to the trunk says it's an aardvark, and the one holding on to the tail says that it's a mule, right? And so many facets and implications here. We're focusing as best we can, just in some ways, on the pedagogical, immediate integration of how to have teachable moments, how to do this kind of critical reflection and examination in the class itself. And that, of course, is going to follow with defining lesson plans and defining outcomes, and then doing assessment to measure those outcomes. But a lot of great questions about policy for faculty research, for the way we use this in other aspects, not just in terms of high stakes assessment for students. And so amazing questions in the chat pod. Justin, I know you've been working at it. Anyone see a question in the chat pod of the guests that they'd like to talk about in particular so far?
The data privacy question, I think it's worth exploring, only because I feel like it's an aspect of digital literacy, and even almost an aspect of rhetorical, I don't know, capacity these days to understand what's happening with this. And it seems like it really has jumped the shark in terms of just not paying attention to things like intellectual property or gathering data, recklessly scraping. There's a whole bunch of really sort of could be bothersome aspects of how your data is being used with this, and it should be something students take away from any experience.
Absolutely, especially when we think about preparing them for the workforce, because as students, they're perceived to be relatively low stakes about mixing and borrowing and remixing for educational purposes. But when you get into the commercial and professional world, now there's lawsuits and paychecks that are on the line. In fact, most companies right now are very confused and are prohibitive about letting their employees use generative AI technologies, because it means that you would be copying and pasting in many circumstances, proprietary information and data into an engine that then has the right to kind of do whatever it wants with that stuff. And so being an employee for Adobe right now, I'm not allowed to use ChatGPT for most of what I do, because I'm not allowed to share Adobe data with an outside source. And so it's all these teachable moments about privacy. And obviously, most people are pretty familiar with misinformation, disinformation, bias, all of those kinds of stereotypes that can be dangerously perpetuated with these technologies. And that's exactly what we mean. I think we talk about becoming critical users of these technologies. But the privacy issue alone, specifically in terms of students, preparing students to be able to do this effectively in the workforce, and understanding where the boundaries may be and the dangers may lie.
Yeah. And I'm going to point out quick, one of my favorite questions in here is how do you cite AI use, right? It's one of my favorite things that comes up all the time. The question was like Firefly for art. Well, Firefly watermarks its stuff, so you've got a kind of built-in citation element. I was just thinking of that as the talk about how do faculty respond, how do we use it as a tool. I think currently the guidance on the citation is what, like you have to put in the entire prompt right, that you use to generate content from, which is seems less effective to me. I know most of the systems, APA and MLA, have taken that kind of approach. I was just thinking about some of these like lower hanging fruit questions that are actually really critical, particularly when you think about faculty starting to use it for their own work, right? And Todd, in your case, using it, you can't upload any sort of corporate content by any means. That would be a disaster. And so the same principle applies to what we upload. But then if we do upload stuff, like if I put my work in there, hopefully that it will cite me, right? That kind of thing. It won't cite me. Don't worry. But then we think about, how do we cite it? How do we approach it? How do we respond to that? It's all part of that larger ethic that goes along with academic integrity and our ability to acknowledge what we're doing. Yeah, I'm intrigued to see how these practices evolve over time, not only in terms of data privacy with what we can upload and what we shouldn't upload. And you shouldn't upload student work, by the way, just as a rule. But more importantly, how do we then cite this thing that's going to be an organic content producer? I may have to have 7 prompts to get the thing that I need. Right. And there's no way these new systems are going to work that way, including Firefly, which I often have to like revise 47 times before I get the one that I want.
Sure. There's a really interesting, great question from Dr. Fabio Chacon, about pronouncing that right. And Bruce, I'd like you to talk about this in particular. An aspect that we really haven't talked about, which is the question is, can we work under assumption that generative AI is like a good tutor for the students? And like that elephant, it isn't one thing, but it can be that. I've heard some really compelling perspectives on folks for whom English is not their first language, and they're writing in an English context in an American university, English-speaking university. And so in terms of enabling students to be more included, to have a more direct access to the habits of mind and the approaches of higher education, and including language. Bruce, that's something I know you're concerned about and you were talking about. But there's ways to integrate AI technologies that might not necessarily have anything to do with turning in written work. It could be using it as a support for studying, or as a tutor, or all different kinds of purposes beyond just performing in terms of academic assignments. Bruce, your thoughts on how these technologies may help students for whom higher education may not be at first the most inclusive or inviting place?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, I would say that something like ChatGPT is not an always reliable tutor. It's more like old Uncle Fred, who has some real insight about certain things and suddenly can drift off into territory that makes no sense. But I think this is why it's so important to break assignments down into smaller components, so that the use of a platform like ChatGPT can tease out student questions, student weaknesses academically, and allow me as the instructor to engage the student in an ongoing dialogue about what's working and what isn't. That seems a very useful way to use generative AI to help support learning. I do think that there's tremendous potential here to help students with a platform like ChatGPT develop a writing project. Now, I'm not the expert in writing. My colleagues here are, but as I said, I teach writing intensive courses, and I'm looking specifically for argument development as part of what the students are doing, the coherence, the logic, and so forth. So we have that in common. Rather than just assigning a student an essay and maybe giving them some signposts as to what they need to be doing along the way, breaking the assignment up may allow the student to, first of all, identify a topic area that is really important, engage with Gen AI to help refine their understanding of what they know, where the gaps are, then move them to the next step in that intellectual process. Again, with the process of engagement with the instructor and their student colleagues and the technology. I think used in that kind of way, with certain parameters set around it, we can rely on something like ChatGPT to be a very useful tool in helping students learn the technique of and the art of writing.
Absolutely. Anyone else see a question they really like in the very rich Q&A?
I've always thought that the sooner we can automate the drudgery of writing, the better for the creativity that comes out of it and these kinds of things. And as soon as library websites started to format the citation for me, I thought that was wonderful. And so, you know, there's a lot of things that AI may be able to kind of off-source that will create more space for interesting learning.
Dan, I always say that the calculator didn't make math worse, right? I think it opened up new possibilities and all kinds of sort of ways of thinking. And I just did this Indiana Teachers of Writing conference, you know, sort of talking with those folks. And we have to let go of some of the things that we hold dear, right, in writing, and because the tool can now do it faster and oftentimes better than what like first year writing students can. But what it's opening up is a shift in that labor, which lets them apply themselves in a different kind of way. So it's rhetorical strategies, it's recognizing audience, it's all the things that we might be doing at the third year level of rhetorical rhetoric classes, as opposed to just, you know, teaching, you know, sort of writing, like how to write a summary. Do they need to know how to write a summary? I don't know. The tools can do it and do it quickly. Do they need to recognize if it's a good summary for the right audience? Yes. Right. And so how do we teach that? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, we have some, you know, we're all playing with ideas, but thinking about what we're actually going to start assessing is part of the shift, right? I no longer need to assess maybe necessarily the quality of the summary, but can I assess their understanding of how the summary works for an audience? And how do I get to that? And so, you know, we've been using reflective practices. I know, Bruce, you had reflective engagements in yours as a staple of that sort of thinking. But it's going to become more and more critical across all disciplines to have that kind of critical reflection moment, whether it's in writing, whether it's a video, which sometimes I do in my class, or a, you know, set of Google Slides. I don't care. It's getting them to think critically backwards on not what was made, but how what was made works for their goals and purposes, and that and explain their content or identifying their ideas. And I don't know what that's going to look like because it's so wonderfully new. But I think that having that kind of orientation is going to be part of where the new labor of writing goes, right?
And I think this goes to Todd's point about student engagement. I mean, we're facing such a tremendous challenge getting students involved, getting students to connect with what we're doing. And in writing intensive courses such as ENC 1101, I know these courses are front loaded on our campus with a lot of remedial work, right? So things like knowing how to cite your sources and formatting and so forth. Our students come in to that environment. As I said, they're already terrified of writing. We don't engage them by saying you need to get through this drudgery before we will even listen to your idea, right? If we can engage them creatively around their interests, then we have a much better chance of retaining them. And then we can use the technology to help reinforce what right now we're front loading as remedial work in our classes. So I think that the engagement piece is really important here. And if I could just throw one other thing in, I think that making students aware of the limitations of generative AI, the problem of AI hallucinations and bias, creates an opportunity, right? Because what it does is it forces us into that meta level evaluation where we're asking students with our help to look at the reliability, the veracity of the content. These are the skills that are much higher up on Bloom's taxonomy. This is where we want them to go. And this technology allows us to spend our time there with them.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, if I were to simplify things, and it's dangerous to do that, I would say that authentic assessment, when we're asking students to truly engage and not just regurgitate ideas and connect them and apply them to the world around them, where they learn by making and doing, and more important than ever is that from an assessment standpoint is the reflection, the narrative, you know, a paragraph of how they found their information, how and when they use generative AI, what that felt like, how that compared to other experiences is more important maybe than the actual product itself, right? It's that, what Bruce just said, it's that metacognitive engagement that really makes it make sense to the students themselves, so that we can learn and become better at these teachable moments as we continue to move forward. So authentic assessment, including reflection. I mean, not to simplify things, but I think that's the best practice we have at this moment. There was an interesting connection thread throughout the 38 questions in the Q&A pod at the moment. I think that's more than we've had in the whole history of the the series combined, thank you so much for doing all that, is access to these technologies. And we know that the digital divide is real. We know whenever a new technology emerges, ultimately, as open source as it may be, at first, there are going to be commercial interests behind that. I work for a company that sells software, Adobe. And so your thoughts about what it means to have access to these technologies. I think the consensus is right now that folks aren't going to be losing their jobs to generative AI. They're going to be losing their job to people who know how to use generative AI. And so how can we promote access and equity of experience with these technologies so they know so people know how to, again, be critical, ethical, and agile users of them?
Yeah, well, we face that challenge of the digital divide in a very real way at Indian River. I think, well, I know our approach has been to partner with the library services, which is home to our tutoring services and many of our labs. We're working on a student use guide of generative AI that's relevant to our classes and our student demographics. And we're working to make sure that that guide gives students instructions about how to access technologies on campus and where they can go for resources, along with the AI literacies that we want them to come out of our programs having mastered. It's a challenge for sure, but I think making this an institutional initiative and working closely with our tutoring labs and computer lab personnel is part of the solution to that.
I think it also bodes well for the people in this webinar, in this cafe, who focus on writing. I think we generally are more plugged into what's useful for students than some other areas on campus. And we can, take comfort in that what we do is already pretty relevant. And if it's not yet relevant, to just keep checking that we're giving, as you said, authentic assessment, but authentic assignments in the first place, and authentic engagement with these tools. It's not, I don't know, it makes the teaching go that much easier too, if the students recognize that this is something that's going to be valuable to them and they're learning it in class, then it's going to help them in the world as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that if we fail to prepare them, we're only furthering the digital divide. It's like double jeopardy, digital inequity, I think is the concept, where they come in and they're already behind, right, their peers because of race, class, gender, whatever the case may be. I mean, as a poor farm kid, I'm familiar with this concept, right? But the idea being that if somebody doesn't actively help us learn and sort of inquire or make us go through these processes to develop these skills while we're in college, then those who came in with the ability to do digital stuff, and more importantly, generative digital stuff, are going to get further and further ahead. Right. So it's if we think about preparing our students for the different disciplines they're going to enter, the different career tracks they might go into, communication and remains a key skill, and leveraging these tools for communication, creativity, collaboration is only just the new part of what it means to be digitally literate. Right. It is perhaps the most emergent part of what it means to be digitally literate. So the divide itself is tied to materiality and access. Do not get me wrong, but there's a conceptual fundamental element to what access means. You can have the tool, but not know how to use it. And so part of what we need to think about strategically is, what does using these tools look like in our own disciplines? And that's sort of how we approach it with our faculty program, development, getting folks in the nursing, school to think about how they might use it, or the folks in dentistry or psychology or econ. And so it's because it doesn't look the same across disciplines, and what they need versus what they're going to do just is different. But, hopefully we start conversations like this, and we give people an opportunity and encourage them to play with these things and say, it's okay to try it, right? What's the worst can happen, right? It makes your assignment worse or better. Like, that seems like a low stakes opportunity to try and help students get to be more successful. And so that's sort of where we're at, is thinking about it as part of that larger sort of trajectory of growth and development, and, the workflows and the entry and the career trajectory sort of elements in terms of the impact across campus.
All right. Last final quick question, and Bruce, I'm going to start with you because I know you study epistemology. This is one of the most influential articles in the space of information and digital technologies. Vannevar Bush, 1945, published in the Atlantic, as we may think. And when hypertext and the internet first came out, everyone looked at Vannevar Bush and you say, well, like, wow, what a futurist. He really saw this coming. In many ways, that's what ChatGPT does. And there's people who are talking about how Google searches may be made obsolete by generative AI searching instead. And so obviously the internet was a revolution. And so my final question, and we don't have much time to unpack this, unfortunately, just around the horn real quickly. On a scale from momentary hype to this is an epistemological revolution, where do you think AI and generative AI lies on that spectrum? Bruce, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. It's an epistemological revolution. Generative AI can make connections that human beings cannot make simply given the massive amounts of information that are produced. So it becomes an agent of knowledge building. That's my short answer. It's a tectonic shift for sure.
Dan, what's your call?
Yeah, I think it's different than some of the technical iterations of the last couple of decades. Yeah, it's pretty game changing, and especially the way that it's leaked into culture. I mean, it's weird. You can't really demarcate it in this way. I mean, we've been doing machine reading of admissions essays on my campus for a long time. The privacy concerns, the ways that our lives are now mediated by technology so radically. I mean, I think it's of a piece on a continuum, but at the same time, it's a rupture of a kind.
What do you think, Justin?
Well, I'm an advocate of thinking that all technologies are in many ways coagential, right? The difference is that this is the first time where most people recognize the tool that we're playing with has agency in a way that is not just like Microsoft telling me when I've misspelled something. That still has a kind of agency, right? But what it comes down to at the end of the day is not how much agency is in the tool, but the very specific human technology relationship that's at the core of that. And so what I can do with, let's say, Adobe Rush is different than what some of my students can do. And if I prepare them accordingly and help them develop these skills, to what they can do with their own sort of ability to interact with these tools, so it changes what we can do. And that's sort of really the fun part of thinking about how these technologies are shifting us. They are inviting us to play in new and exciting ways, and preparing us to try and engage sort of new processes along the path, and think of them as partners in the journey, not just as a tool I master, but as a thing that I get to play with on my way to this kind of outcome or expression.
All right. As monumental these changes are, the consensus seems pretty consistent. I think there's a lot of response in the Q&A pod to this idea that we are responsible now for enabling students as a fundamental outcome across the curriculum to be critical ethical users of these technologies, that the best pedagogical practice is for them to learn by doing, by making, in authentic assessment and then evaluated through reflection. I have to do a plug at this moment because I truly believe this, even though I work for Adobe, that Adobe Firefly and Express right now, in this moment, is the most affordable, scalable, accessible, and responsible way to put generative AI in the hands of your students. And that is largely due to Adobe's involvement in the Content Authenticity Initiative and the way we have led at Adobe in terms of the respect for intellectual property and copyright with the development of our data sets. And so if you want to find out more about Express and Firefly, there's a link to do so there. I am so grateful to everyone who attended today. We are at the top of the hour and we're a minute over. Thanks for all your questions. We will add as much material as we can to the archive to address as many of the questions as we can. We'll also make sure the recording is available. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Thanks especially to our three outstanding panelists and friends of mine now, Justin, Bruce, and Daniel. Thank you so much for being with us today. Until November 1st, I think. Oh, and thanks behind the scenes, Paula, who's making all of this come together and all of this work. The next Digital Literacy Cafe, I believe, is November 1st, where we will be looking specifically at the implications of visual generative AI, visual communication, visual narratives, especially for folks who are in the creative professions. How is this going to change what people do in design, in graphic design, in videography, in photography? And so we're going to have some experts who know a lot about that We're going to especially look at visual narrative and visual communication in the next installment in November. So again, thanks everyone for being here. Look forward to talking again next month. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.